wait a minute or two until we get all of our participants in. Welcome. So we'll get started and let everyone come in. Good evening. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I'm delighted to host this evening's program on behalf of our museum here in Hartford, Connecticut. Tonight, we are welcoming Nicole Hemmer and Adam Hilton for a discussion of Hemmer's new book, Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s. I'll be introducing our guests more formally in just a moment, but first I want to thank our sponsors for this event. The Mark Twain House and Museum's virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring Frank Lord, a beloved trustee of the museum who passed away a few years ago. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, which he would have loved so much. We're also incredibly grateful to the Wish You Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting tonight's program and all our other virtual programs. One of the benefits of this being a virtual program is that you, as the audience, can have your own conversation in the chat alongside our guests' discussion tonight, and we do encourage you to do so. We will also be posting the link to purchase a signed copy of Partisans from our store. Getting your copy through our store not only gets you a copy of the book, but also benefits the Mark Twain House and Museum. If you have any specific question for Nikki and Adam, you can go ahead and post that directly into our Q&A section for the end of the program. Please also note that you can click on live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. Now that I've said all that I want to now that I've said all that I wanted to say, let's get down to formally introduce our guests for tonight. So our moderator is Adam Hilton. Adam Hilton is assistant professor of politics at Mount Holyoke College. His research and teaching focuses on the contentious relationship between political parties and activist groups and its effects on representational inequality and democratic governance in American political development. His first book, True Blues, The Contentious Transformation of the Democratic Party, was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2021. And Nikki Hemmer, our author, is an associate professor of history and director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the Study of the Presidency at Vanderbilt University. She is the author of Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s, and Messengers of the Right, conservative media and the transformation of American politics. A prolific writer and podcaster, she is currently a columnist at CNN and co-host of the podcasts This Day in Esoteric Political History and Past Present, which is a favorite of mine. Please sit back and enjoy. And don't forget, there will be a Q&A at the end of the program, so make sure to post your questions. Over to you, Adam and Nikki.
Great, thank you so much, Omar. And thanks to the Mark Twain House for hosting the event, and thanks to everyone this evening who are joining us to discuss Nikki's new and excellent and eminently readable book, Partisans, the conservative revolutionaries who remade American politics in the 1990s. As Omar mentioned, I teach courses on American politics at Mount Holyoke College, but I'm actually currently on leave. And if you know academics, or if you are one, then you know that we take our sabbaticals very seriously, quite desperate to reserve that time for research and writing. But as it happened, when Omar's email first landed in my inbox asking me if I would moderate this discussion, I was quite literally in the middle of poring over Nikki's new book, learning so much from it, and so knew I had to jump at the opportunity. And if you haven't already read the book, I'm sure discussion will show you why you should. So with that, welcome, Nikki, and thank you so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Adam. And thank you for taking time in the middle of your sabbatical to do this. I really appreciate it.
Of course. So there is so much in this book, a lot of substance, a lot of stuff that we will just barely get to skim the surface of tonight. But before we get into that, if we might just begin with the question, why did you write this book?
So I have been thinking about the 1990s and the right for a very long time. And the sort of germ of this book really did come out of my first book. There's this throwaway line that I wrote at the end of Partisans that talks about when Ronald Reagan was elected, that it was both a victory and a valedictory, that it was both a triumph and the end of something. And at the time, I'm not sure even I knew exactly what I meant by that. I knew that it was a major victory when Ronald Reagan won in 1980 for the conservative movement. But there also was something coming to an end. And it was through this book that I figured out what that was. And that was the Cold War conservative movement, that Ronald Reagan really embodied that movement. And he was a triumph for that movement. But when the Cold War ends, pretty much at the end of his presidency, the logic of that movement and the centripetal force that was holding it together disappears, and something new begins to grow in the absence of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned your first book, which I'll also plug for those who haven't read it, Messengers of the Right, an instant classic amongst those of us who study social movements and particularly conservatism in American political development. And you mentioned that there was an intellectual connection, but do you maybe want to relate how the books connect thematically, if it isn't too much of a stretch? As I was reading Partisans, I was almost thinking of it, if you will, as a sequel to Messengers of the Right.
Yes, in many ways it is a sequel. So Messengers of the Right looked at media activists who were building the conservative movement from the 1940s, early 1950s through the late 1970s. And it really focused on the importance of these conservative media institutions to the construction of Cold War conservative politics. And this book also really has a strong media component. It tackles the rise of things like talk radio and Fox News, what I called in my first book, the second generation of conservative media activism. But I would also say that it widens the lens in some ways to talk about the role that non-conservative media played in the rise of this new conservative movement in the 1990s. And I think the other connective tissue is, one of the things that I trace at the beginning of Messengers of the Right is the way that the old right, the conservative movement of the 1930s and early 1940s, develops into the Cold War conservative movement. What we're seeing in the 1990s is kind of the reemergence of the old right, clawing back space in the US political landscape and reasserting itself.
Yeah, and let's circle back around to some of those details in just a minute. But at least for me, maybe for you, maybe for most of the people in the audience, the 1990s feels like it happened about 15 minutes ago, though not for our students, probably. But could you talk a little bit about, you're a political historian, can you talk about why it's important to think about the 90s through the lens of history?
Absolutely. I don't want to alarm anyone, but the 1992 election was 30 years ago. So I know it feels like it just happened, but it's been a while now. I think that this is an important question that historians ask all the time. Where does history end and something like journalism or political science or political analysis begin? And I think that the thing that historians do is they bring a particular mode of thinking, a historical way of understanding the world and asking questions about the past. And so what's actually very interesting about Partisans is I'm writing about the 1990s at the same time that a lot of journalists are writing about the 1990s. Steve Kornacki has a book out called The Red and the Blue, which looks at Newt Gingrich and Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Dana Milbank has a new book out called The Destructionists that also traces from the 1990s on the emergence of Donald Trump. And I think actually Milbank's book is instructive for the difference between journalists and historians. Milbank is starting with Donald Trump's election in 2016 and looking back and trying to find out where all of the echoes for Donald Trump came from. I really am starting from the end of the Reagan presidency and looking forward and trying to make sense of the historical forces and the historical changes that are giving rise to something new in the conservative movement, something new that will ultimately make space for, and in some ways kind of overdetermine the election of Donald Trump in 2016, but that allows for much more contingency, I think.
Excellent. And that's also something, the connection with Trump is certainly something I'd like to come back to in a minute. But so if we could begin to drill down into some of the substance of the book. So if one way of characterizing the story you tell is that the book narrates what you might call the decline and fall of Reaganism in the Republican Party. Could you describe to us what Reaganism was and maybe how it differs from the conservatism that came after it?
So Reaganism really is this Cold War conservatism that sort of filtered through the personality and the persona of Ronald Reagan. It is something that is popular. Ronald Reagan won 2 landslide elections. He really did create a kind of big tent Republicanism as he invited what would become known as Reagan Democrats into the party. It was a conservatism that was in many ways kind of obsessed with not just the language of freedom and democracy, but which really translated that rhetoric into policy. So Ronald Reagan was somebody who believed in free trade because it was an alternative to communism. He believed in the free movement of peoples. He was obviously his 1986 immigration reform, but at the beginning of his campaign in 1980, he calls for a North America Accord, which would allow for the free flow of goods and people, something that sort of prefigures the North American Free Trade Agreement. And there was a kind of projection of optimism that was really important to Reaganism. Now, not everybody read that as optimistic. Not everybody read Reagan as popular or hopeful. His policies were damaging to a lot of people, and he wasn't popular among, say, Black Americans. But he was broadly popular among white voters. What comes after looks very different. If you look at somebody like Pat Buchanan, who runs for president in 1992 and had been kind of a Reaganite in the 1980s, he'd worked in the Reagan administration. He gave up on all of that. If you remember his 1992 convention speech, it reflected the spirit of his campaign. It was anti-establishment, it was angry, it was pessimistic, it talked about American decline, it was anti the Republican and conservative establishment, it was anti-immigrant. He was developing a new nativism in his campaign, including campaign stops at the border calling for the Buchanan fence, which was a precursor to the idea of building the wall on the border. And he was also somebody who, absent the forces of the Cold War, was suddenly saying that democracy was not necessarily the best form of government. He's writing in 1990 about this idea that democracy isn't that efficient. It doesn't give us what we want. Autocracy is a much better model. And there's just no space in American politics for a mainstream political candidate to make that argument during the Cold War. It really does take this post-Cold War moment for somebody like Pat Buchanan to be able to gain so much traction in the Republican Party.
And so one of the ways you characterize this distinction in the book is you compare Reagan's, I think what you call his sunny side conservatism, right? That infusion of Cold War conservatism with an optimistic, almost triumphalist position regarding democracy and capitalism and the West, in contrast to Buchanan, who, for many of us is a figure who, if we remember him at all, we remember him as almost exclusively a 1990s phenomenon, right? But as your book shows so well, Buchanan really prefigures, if I could use that word, a lot of the politics that we've been very familiar with since 2016, 2015. So part of what I wanted to ask you about here is that what was it that gave, or to frame it another way, we're used to hearing about all kinds of criticisms of the Reagan administration from the left during the 80s, even into the George H.W. Bush years. But as your book details, this post-Cold War conservatism, right, the nastier, more grievance-driven conservatism, doesn't just come out of nowhere, right, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, right, but really had been growing as the right criticized the Reagan administration all through the 80s. So could you give us a little bit more about, we know it's widely known what the left and what liberals, what kind of problems they had with the Reagan administration, but the right had problems with it too. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. There was a group of social conservatives, both grassroots activists and political organizers in the 1970s and 1980s who actually saw Reagan as too moderate, who thought that he needed to be pulled further to the right, that he actually needed to embrace polarization and division, and he was being too pragmatic and too optimistic. So the political activists called themselves the New Right. And when the 1980 campaign rolled around, they did not support Ronald Reagan. He was their third choice. They finally reluctantly back him. And when he's in office, they just pummel him throughout his presidency. Richard Viguerie, who is one of these New Right leaders, says 3 weeks into the Reagan administration, I knew we'd get the short end of the stick. I just didn't know it would be this short. And it was comments like that throughout his presidency. There was a symposium by 1984, is Reagan really a conservative? And a lot of people, including people like Pat Buchanan and Newt Gingrich, were saying, no, he's not far enough right. He's not a pure enough conservative, because they saw him opting for popularity over hardline conservatism, that he wasn't pushing for a national ban on abortion, that he wasn't pushing for a constitutional amendment on school prayer, and a number of heresies that he commits throughout his presidency. He raises taxes twice. He appoints Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, and she's considered too moderate. And the biggest sin of all, he opens up relations with the Soviet Union in 1987. And if you look back at the archives, the New Right loses its mind when this happens. I mean, they call Reagan a traitor. They call him a willful idiot of the Soviet conspiracy, because they're so disappointed and so frustrated. And I think it's important that it's people like Pat Buchanan who's saying that Reagan isn't conservative enough. Pat Buchanan is saying in the 1980s that the biggest political vacuum in American politics is to the right of Reagan. And somebody like Newt Gingrich is saying, Ronald Reagan is choosing to govern when he should be polarizing the country. And it's that sentiment that is really sort of tamped down by Reagan's popularity, that after he leaves office is allowed to flower very fully, especially during the presidency of George H.W. Bush.
Yeah, it's also perhaps a second thread that runs through your book. In addition to these shifting ideas and these persona on the right, there's an institutional story here too, right? As you tell us in the book, throughout the Cold War, the conservative movement and the Republican Party were dead set on trying to capture the presidency as an institution. But over the course of the 1990s, there's a shift of focus, indeed one that turns out to be quite successful, of turning away from the presidency to try and capture Congress. Could you tell us a little bit more about what motivated that shift and what kind of implications did that have?
This is a massive change that happens on the right because the conservative movement for decades had been obsessed with the presidency. They had been backing candidates, sometimes third-party candidates, independent candidates in the 40s and 50s, Barry Goldwater in 1960 and 64, independent candidates again in the 1970s when they thought that the Republican Party had gone a little wobbly. And then with Reagan, they get exactly what they want. They get this conservative movement figure who has become president of the United States, and he's done so in these landslide victories, and they're so disappointed. And then George H.W. Bush wins in a landslide, and they're even more disappointed. And it becomes clear, I think, to many conservatives that the presidency isn't enough. They still want to win the presidency, but that it's not enough, that it's not where they should be focusing their efforts. And there really is a shift to focusing on Congress. And it's understandable why conservatives would have been wary of Congress. They hadn't controlled either house for decades. They hadn't controlled the House of Representatives for more than 40 years at that point. So, it might have felt a little impossible, this idea of actually controlling Congress. But you had a figure in Newt Gingrich who had also made taking Congress his focus, and had brought a politics of polarization to his vision of what he would do in Congress. And what he does is he ultimately nationalizes congressional elections. And I think people have heard talk about this idea of nationalized elections. But it's very different than voting for president, which is also a national election, because at the end of the day, members of Congress are still chosen by these very tiny districts. And that allows for much more radical candidacies, and it allows for more radicalism and extremism when it comes to these candidates. And so you've nationalized elections, you've turned your attention to Congress, and suddenly you have a Congress that is well to the right, even of Ronald Reagan. And that becomes the driver and the focus of conservative politics in the 1990s. And I would argue, even to a certain extent, in the 2000s, when George W. Bush becomes president, there still is a real focus on Congress, congressional obstruction and leadership. And when it comes to Republicans against George W. Bush, particularly around issues of immigration reform, Congress again steps forward as a leader. So that institutional shift is really important.
And I think we could trace it up even to the focus of the Tea Party insurgency. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And that Tea Party insurgency that comes really in response to the election of Barack Obama. It had as one of its lead figures, Sarah Palin, who had been on the national ticket, and Glenn Beck, who was a national radio host. But when it came to where the Tea Party was actually leaving its mark on American politics, it was in these House and Senate elections. And even though there were a number of Tea Party candidates who were not maybe yet ready for the national stage, and who would ultimately lose what many people thought were winnable seats for Republicans, they took out a whole generation of Republican leaders, established incumbents, and opened up a space for a new generation of Republicans, and Republicans who are much further to the right and more absolutist in their politics during the elections in the 2010s. So absolutely, that shift in focus for the Tea Party was incredibly important.
Excellent. And there is, as you've already made mention, a third component of this book, along with the tracing of the evolution of ideas, the institutional shift of focus from the presidency to also Congress. But a lot like your first book, this book also has media play, if you will, one of the main characters, right? And in Messengers of the Right, your first book, you looked, as you said before, at how conservative talk radio was a key instrument, a key device for building the Cold War right the Cold War conservative movement. Can you tell us in a little bit more detail about how media was changing in the 1990s and how that related to the emergence and the spread of this post-Cold War right?
The media landscape in the 1990s was undergoing a dramatic transformation. You had the rise of all of these highly interactive media in ways that we just had never really seen before. Something like the Rush Limbaugh show, this national radio show that begins in 1988, becomes a national phenomenon by the early 1990s, is not just 3 hours of conservative talk a day, something that Americans hadn't witnessed before. It was drawing millions of people. It was wildly profitable. Again, hadn't happened before, but it was interactive. We now had the technology where people across the country could listen to the broadcast simultaneously, and they could use a toll-free number in order to call in and be part of the programming. And that actually really matters because the early 1990s in particular were a period in which people in the United States felt pretty frustrated and they felt unheard. And we could see that across the political and cultural spectrum, but we could also see it on like CNN, not a conservative station, the only cable news channel at the time. A show like Larry King Live, which was the most popular show on CNN from the moment it debuted in 1985, it becomes this place where people can call in, they can hear themselves talk on national television, which is a new phenomenon. But politicians too see these new interactive media as a place where they need to be because they're looking for new ways to connect with people who are suspicious of established institutions. And so you see this very clearly in something like the 1992 election. You have Pat Buchanan, who, even though he had worked in a few different administrations, really is a national household name because of his years hosting Crossfire on CNN and being a panelist on the McLaughlin Group on PBS. Ross Perot, who announces his candidacy on Larry King Live, and that's also where he becomes this kind of political commentator through frequent appearances on Larry King's show. But even Bill Clinton, I mean, we all know these stories, right? Of Bill Clinton running in 1992 and going on MTV, a relatively new cable channel, and talking about politics. And that's actually really important too. I mean, we focus a lot on the rise of conservative talk radio in the 90s, but the emergence of cable and the adoption of cable in households across the United States really does shift the media landscape. It means that you have hundreds of options where once you just had 3 or 4. And those new stations are trying to find ways to define themselves. And it's interesting how many of them define themselves by moving to a space that blends politics and entertainment. MTV is a music station, and yet in 1992, it's devoting its time to rocking the vote and to registering young people to vote. The Comedy Central, which was a relatively new channel in the early 1990s, has as its tentpole program Bill Maher's Politically Incorrect, another show that blended together politicians and comedians and actors and encouraged them all to kind of swap roles. So you have actors and comedians weighing in on politics, and you have politicians and activists who are trying to be comedians, who are establishing this new kind of outrageous and funny punditry style that would become pretty familiar to people who watch like MSNBC or Fox News. So you have this media landscape that is fractured, that's interactive, and that is eroding the walls between politics and entertainment. And that fundamentally changes politics in the United States. So those media changes are, you can't overstate how important they are to the politics of the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as you referenced earlier about reading history forward, there is the way that these 3 narratives of the book start layering together towards the end. While the book is not about Trump, right, given that it's about the 90s, the book does conclude with his victory in 2016, and there's a way in which the narrative has led us to entirely see the election of Donald Trump, which I can speak for political scientists, caught us all off guard, as not inevitable, right? But it follows quite logically in a sense of the reality TV incendiary New York playboy having, as you say in different contexts in the book, not an organized faction behind him, but an audience, right? He brought that to politics, and that was already prepared for. So maybe, and we could probably start segueing towards looking at Q&A. Could you talk a little bit about how you see this book contributing to these ongoing debates that, not just political scientists, not just historians, but many concerned people are having right now about the place of Trump and Trumpism in American politics, and how do you see your book contributing to that conversation?
One of the major debates that followed the 2016 election was about Trump exceptionalism. Did Donald Trump represent a stark rupture with the past, or was he the end result of larger historic forces that had been at work for some time? As people who haven't read the book can tell from this conversation, I clearly side with the latter, this idea that, again, he was not inevitable, but he's very legible once you have this history laid out. And that is to say that just the incentive structures of the conservative movement and the Republican Party had been changing for quite some time, moving away from incentives to work with the other party, a lot of that being fed by the emerging media ecosystem, that there was a real desire to make sure that the electorate was polarized, to make sure that the electorate was entertained, to make sure that you were able to outrage and draw the eyeballs of voters in a very crowded media and news environment. I mean, I think that's also one of the things that comes out of this book, is that it gets more and more difficult to connect with voters, to find voters, to get the attention of voters in a more fractured media environment. And so it takes a particular kind of politician or a particular kind of celebrity to be able to get enough oxygen to get people's attention. So there are a lot of changes that are happening over the course of the 90s and the 2000s. And I do want to mention just one more change that the book traces, because I think it helps us make sense of why the momentum toward what would eventually become Trumpism accelerated so much in the 2010s. And that is, you have a figure like George W. Bush, who really was associated with Reagan in a lot of ways. When he was elected, or when he won the Electoral College vote in the Supreme Court decision in 2000, he is somebody who the newspapers were calling George W. Reagan, and saying that he was the son of George H.W. Bush, but he was the heir of Ronald Reagan. He was the author of Compassionate Conservatism. He was somebody who believed in deregulation and steep tax cuts. And he was somebody who believed, like, I'm from the government and I'm here to help, were actually the scariest words in the English language. So he has this affinity with Ronald Reagan, but then he fails on so many fronts, right? You have that deregulation and you have the global financial crisis. You have a kind of democracy-centered foreign policy, and you have the quagmires in Afghanistan and Iraq. You have this idea that government is the problem, not the solution. You have Hurricane Katrina, where people are left to fend for themselves in the middle of one of the worst natural disasters in a century. And by the end of the Bush administration, there is so much kindling for this Buchananite right to surge to the leadership of the party, to kind of overwhelm what was left of the Reaganite right. And that feels like an important piece of the puzzle as you're looking forward and trying to figure out, how does the party ultimately land on Trumpism? It's those failures, the rise of the Tea Party, and then all of those forces we've been talking about, that again, Trump is not inevitable. Trump could have lost that election, and all of these forces would still be in play in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement. It just so happens that Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016, and I think accelerated many of the trends and forces we've been talking about.
Yeah, excellent. Well, thank you. Thank you for that, Nikki. So why don't we open up things for some audience questions? Maybe Omar might have the first one ready to go. Let's see.
Yes. Let me just change here. Yes, we have a question here that is asking, do you feel the grip of Fox News will loosen on the GOP politicians and electorate, or do you think viewers and politicians will drift further right to things like Newsmax and Breitbart?
So this is an excellent question, because we've actually seen some moments where that drift has been very visible and has been very stark in the conservative media ecosystem. One of those moments was in early 2016, when Fox News seemed a little iffy on Donald Trump, and you had viewers and conservative media consumers at that time really moving to places like Breitbart News. After the 2020 election, when Fox News declared that Joe Biden had won the election and was backing away from some of the conspiracy theories about that election, you see actually this time millions of viewers, or at least 1 million viewers, moving over to Newsmax and OAN. Importantly, Fox News changes to get those viewers back. It's not about to, say incendiary things about Dominion voting machines or anything, so they don't want to be sued for billions of dollars. But they were willing to kind of double down on Trumpism, both after the 2016 election and after the 2020 election. So Newsmax is still going to exist in many ways as a cudgel to keep Fox News in line. Fox News, I think, for the time being, is going to remain pretty powerful within the conservative movement. So conservative media today really do act as the communications arm of the Republican Party, or maybe the Republican Party is the electoral arm of conservative media. So even if it's ultimately not Fox News, I do think that some conservative media outlets are going to remain in kind of the pole position for the conservative movement for the foreseeable future. It's so powerful, and it has so much sway over US politics today that the incentive structure is all there to ensure both that those media remain in place and they remain in line with the Trumpite base.
I've got another question I could ask if we're waiting, if we're greasing the wheels a little bit to break the ice. But Nikki, I wonder if you might talk a little bit about social media. Your book and books have focused mainly on, of course, radio in the post-war years, and increasingly cable, as you were discussing, both news channels, but also non-news channels, MTV, Comedy Central. But could you, as the story approaches the present, of course, the internet and then eventually social media become key devices in our politics. I mean, really become central players in some ways in our politics. And while I know that that is not the focus of the book, if you might want to comment a little bit about that and how you see the role of social media, what role it plays in this story.
Sure. So I have a couple of different thoughts about that. And one is that the conservative base was hungry for some sort of connective media that it could use to organize and that it could use to connect with other conservatives. It's something that I discovered as I was writing this book, that there were activists who were using fax trees in order to spread messaging and spread conspiracy theories, because that was the technology that they had on hand. And the internet, of course, is in existence in the 1990s, and conservatives are adopting it for things like blogging. Blogging becomes much more popular on the right in the early 2000s. Social media is a game changer, though, because, we talk about conservative talk radio being interactive. There really isn't anything like social media for people feeling that they have a voice, that they have power, within the media ecosystem, right? That they can develop stories, they can publish stories, they can spread stories, they can serve as kind of a trusted messenger to their communities and to the large network of people that they're connected with through those social media. And social media really changes things for politicians as well, particularly politicians who are more anti-establishment or more populist. And here I don't just mean Donald Trump, like Barack Obama brings one of the Facebook founders onto his campaign in 2008. And that fit very cleanly within the ethos of his campaign and with this idea of doing politics differently and building a new majority. So social media had already sort of changed politics before Donald Trump appeared. What Donald Trump did was, if Barack Obama had Facebook, Donald Trump had Twitter. And that sort of faster, more emotional, more endorphin producing kind of media, more dopamine producing media, social media was something that fits so neatly with Trump's campaign, but it was something that the politicians had already shown the power of. Think about somebody like Chuck Grassley, who would always write these like badly spelled kind of kooky tweets, and he got kind of a cult following for doing it because people found something very authentic about that. And Donald Trump was able to use Twitter to project an appearance of authenticity because he was willing to say such outrageous things, and so many people were liking it and retweeting it. So he showed the real power that Twitter and social media could have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'd add to that too. Your book, all your work shows the conservative movement writ large has been prone to conspiracy theories for quite a long time. But as you show with, say, the case of Lou Dobbs at CNN, those conspiracy theories could get airtime, but eventually would run up against an editorial limit where they would say, you know what, we're losing sponsors. You can't talk like that, or you got to go, right? And eventually left. Social media, of course, besides community guidelines, loosely enforced, has provided a breeding ground for the rapid dissemination of not just misinformation but disinformation too.
That's exactly right, and that's why moderation and guidelines have been such a central point of contention over the past several years, precisely because of that. The lack of moderation or the lack of editorial guidance has loosened all of those forces.
We have another question in the Q&A. It is, what is the future of the moderate Republican? Do you feel like they will gravitate toward the Democratic Party as the GOP continues its move to the right?
This is a great question too, because the moderate Republican has been such an important figure in the history of conservatism, particularly in the 1960s and the 1970s, as conservatives were becoming more prominent in the Republican Party. Moderate Republicans like George Romney, like Nelson Rockefeller, who's actually maybe even a liberal Republican, they were increasingly kind of endangered species. So by the time you get to the 1990s, the Republican Party is almost purely conservative. And yet there is a real difference between moderate conservatives who still believe in bipartisanship, who believe in compromise, who can be somewhat pragmatic in their politics, and these more hardline conservatives. There's even a group during the 1990s in the House that call themselves the True Believers, and they're constantly like threatening Newt Gingrich, saying they're going to like kick him out of the speaker's chair because they want more hardline politics. What's interesting about moderate Republicans today, or moderate conservatives, is there are so few of them. You had 10 members of the House, I think, who voted for Donald Trump's impeachment. They would be considered moderate Republicans for having made that decision. But you had 147 Republicans who voted not to certify the 2020 election. Those numbers obviously swamp the members of the Republican Party who stood up against it. Never Trumpers. are a handful of people, at least in terms of writers and members of the Republican Party. Certainly there are more Never Trump voters, but not that many of them. I mean, if you look, you not only see that Republican office holders vote very closely with Donald Trump and embrace his agenda, but Republican voters fell in line with Donald Trump throughout his presidency. So what future is there for the moderate Republican? I think that the definition is just going to continue to shift to the right. That somebody like Marjorie Taylor Greene at some point is probably going to be seen as a moderate Republican. But I do think that it is it's a pretty small group. It is a group that is well to the right of moderate Republicans, even just 10, 15 years ago. Some of them will join the Republican, or some of them will join the Democratic Party, particularly if they sense real danger in the person that the Republicans nominate. Some of them will drift back into the Republican Party if they feel like the danger of Donald Trump has passed. But we're still talking about a relatively small group of people.
Yeah, it's curious. The question wasn't directed to me exactly, but my two cents on it is, until it is remarkable to me that the Lincoln Project and the other efforts, small though they are, and mostly social media ties though they are, the other efforts of moderate Republicans to build some kind of coalition as an alternative to Trumpism in the Republican Party, it is remarkable how unsuccessful they've been. They just completely fail to get that project off the ground. And so I think even fairly pragmatic politicians that simply, right, they want to win office, they want to build a career in Washington, they may not be dyed-in-the-wool MAGA Republicans, but I think they see that, look, they've got no choice but to keep their head down and move with the rest of the party.
And I think bearing that out is that Republican office holders who voted to impeach Donald Trump aren't Republican office holders anymore. The loss that Liz Cheney faced in her reelection campaign, I think, is part of the feedback loop that explains why moderate Republicanism or moderate conservatism or pragmatic conservatism is just largely non-existent. I do think on the institution front, it's really interesting because groups like the Lincoln Project and some of these Never Trump organizations, some of the publications like the Dispatch, the Bulwark, all of which were founded in opposition to Donald Trump. It's always seemed that their readership and their audience has been Democrats and liberals. And I think Democrats and liberals who want to believe that vision for the Republican Party or the conservative movement may at the moment be the remnant, just sort of like the few left who are going to keep the tradition alive, who are going to keep the flame burning during this period and will be able to reemerge later. Maybe, but I'm not sure that those institutions are particularly robust at the moment.
I have a question about that actually, and maybe this is a question for both of you. As a slightly younger voter, I think I'm in the demographic of when we hear the older politicians, especially the leaders in Congress, say, well, we just want to reach across the aisle, and they're reaching across the aisle and reaching across the aisle thing. Is that something that people feel like a nostalgia for, that it actually existed? Did it exist? Did it not exist? Is there ever a chance that it would happen again? I think a lot of us say no, but where does that come from, and why is it still being held up as a thing that will inevitably happen again?
It's absolutely nostalgia, particularly for this period in the mid-20th century that a lot of people have a lot of nostalgia for, but that we might think of as, in many ways, the great exception in American history, this period in which the two parties were so ideologically mixed that, of course, there was bipartisanship because you had conservative Democrats from the South who were making common cause with conservative Republicans who were represented by people like Barry Goldwater. And so they had this common ground, and you had liberal Republicans who were major supporters of Black civil rights, and you had African Americans in the Democratic Party. And there's a lot of common ground to be found between the two parties in that period. And there was also a kind of, just as objectivity was kind of the foremost value in journalism, this idea of being polite and being respectful in politics, there was a kind of cachet to that. And so the idea that you would fight all day in the Senate and then you would go back and you would like have brandies at night was something that was pretty common because you were all members of the same elite club, which is part of the thing that voters were pushing back against by the 1970s and 80s and so on. And people want to believe in that kind of comedy, C-O-M-I-T-Y, that kind of coming together, and this idea that politics can be respectful and that governance can work, that technocracy can work. That's not where our politics is now, in part because of that ideological sort, in part because of the changing media environment. It could happen again in the future, sure, and any future is possible, but it is not the direction the parties are headed towards now, in part because there isn't a lot of common ground. There's not a shared set of values, and not even really a shared reality that they're responding to. And as long as that doesn't exist, it's impossible to see how true bipartisan cooperation can really result in effective policy.
Yeah, if I could add my 2 cents on this too. I mean, I can from one angle, even if it is coded in a kind of overly saccharine nostalgia, there's obviously a pragmatic need for bipartisanship in an age where it is really rare, in an age where everything is filibustered in the Senate, and where it is really rare for a party to win filibuster-proof majorities. So something that might be keeping that language alive, other than generational, gazing in the rearview mirror, might be the raw fact that these coalitions are always looking for someone they can pull across the aisle to break a filibuster and actually turn bills into laws. Though that rarely happens, right? It almost never happens. Now, not on anything of major significance. And then, just another gloss on what Nikki already said, the stakes of small d democratic politics in the United States today are higher than they were in, the age of C-O-M-I-T-Y comedy in the 1950s and 60s, right? I mean, most of the 1960s wasn't 1968. Right, most of the 1960s was Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater, right, and Mad Men. Instead, since '68 to the present, lots of democratic, again, small d, democratic movements have achieved major victories, and a lot of anti-democratic counter movements, as Nikki has ably documented, have risen up since then and built a really powerful movement and colonized the political party. So the stakes are higher, right? And in that kind of moment where two different parties have two vastly different visions about who they serve and what kind of future they'd like to build, bipartisanship, there's very little common ground, as Nikki already said, and that's exactly what we should expect.
And I think this actually goes to the next question in the queue, which is, there a Democrat who would actually be palatable to Republicans, or are heels too deeply dug in? And this explains why heels are too deeply dug in. Because you think about the nomination of somebody like Joe Biden, who on paper looks like he would have been catnip for the Republican voters. It's blue collar Joe, somebody who had long been seen as a more moderate figure, somebody who had been seen as part of the white working class, and somebody who could speak for the white working class. And so seemed like he would be able to draw off some Republican voters. And the combination of both Joe Biden needing to meet the needs of those small d democratic movements that had been so important to the Democratic Party, really changed his palatability, but also, I mean, the number of conspiracy theories and really strong anti-Biden language, Biden as a radical, took off the moment he won the nomination, and has only accelerated in the period since. So it is at least hard right now to imagine in the state of partisanship and polarization and big D democratic politics, and actually anti-small d democratic politics on the right, that you could find a Democratic candidate that would win over a substantial number of Republicans.
Like we have any more questions. Anything else that you two want to wrap up with in the last couple minutes that we have?
You know, I think that I would just say that part of the discussion that we've been having suggests that there's been an erosion of a common set of values, a common set of agreements. And I think that my book shows how that erosion happened, but it is a reminder that some of the things that we've taken for granted in American politics, that there is a consensus on things like free and fair elections and small d democracy and liberal democracy as a form of government and a way of life, there isn't a consensus on those things. And so the challenge for US politics going forward is going to be, how do you rebuild that consensus? And how do you make the affirmative case for democracy as a form of government? I think we've skipped that step for a very, very long time in US political culture. And I think that recent years have really demonstrated the need to not just assert that democracy is the best form of government, not just assert that free and fair elections are the way that our leadership structure should be decided, but that there should be a real effort to make the case for the kind of government that we think is best. And those kind of first principle arguments seem to me to be where we are right now in US politics.
Well said.
Well, and since we're closing out, I will also bring one more visitor
Oh,
up
yes.
here. Everybody always appreciates a puppy. So
Who's that? What's his name?
this is Nala, and she's been very good for the last hour. So she gets a little cameo.
Oh, well, it's great to see Nala, and thank you so much, Nikki and Adam, for this really amazing discussion. It was a pleasure to be here and to host you. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. If you joined us late or want to go back and rewatch the program, you're in luck. All of the Mark Twain House's virtual programs are posted on our YouTube channel and available for you to watch whenever you would like. You can also check out the events page to see all of our upcoming programs and hopefully join us for another event in the future. That's all the housekeeping I have for tonight. So thank you again for joining us and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.